Yeah, today we are going to talk briefly about state capacity. State's capacity can be defined as the ability of government to administer its territory effectively. And when we talk about state capacity, it's something we can compare countries whether they show more or less capacity. But frankly, I would suggest that while we talk about some states having more capacity than other states, I think a lot of times we talk about in certain policy areas, maybe education policy, health policy, or whatever it might be, a state might show more or less capacity. Obviously, some states have less capacity. They are going show they're going to show low capacity in all kinds of areas. But I think simply just saying, you know, this country has a lot of capacity and that country has less is not as useful. And if this is a topic, if you choose to write, it might be more effective to focus on single area. This idea of state capacity is one where you can really think of it having four dimensions. First, is the idea of extractive capacity, that the ability of state to take out of society. Society produces a lot of things. It has natural resources and things like that. Now, if a state simply allow the people or the natural resources that it has to remain untapped, that does not make the state or government any stronger. It might be that people have larger capacity to produce things, but that doesn't mean that the state can do one thing or the other. Now, the extractive capacity is basically the ability to take some of what your society is producing and take it for the government so that it can put it to use if the government decides. Obviously, the key way of doing this through taxation. And so we would suggest that states that tax their citizens more highly would have a stronger extractive capacity. This can be done by passing laws. US to 2018 passed a law that reduced its extractive capacity, particularly in terms of businesses. There is now a far lower taxes on businesses. The government wants to do something, it is taking lot less revenue, but then it need not only be this idea of taking some taking from the individual, it can also be the ability to extract your natural resources. If the state chooses to do so, whether you choose to keep the natural resources in the hands of government or whether you let private entities to keep control of these, or you may just choose not to exploit certain resources, not to drill for oil, not to fish your fisheries, or things like that. So that is the first example, the extractive capacity. Now, the extractive capacity by itself is worthless, I would say, because it is simply that government or state have the ability to exploit. I don't mean that in a bad way, but just just to take your resources or do something with it. The second part is actually doing something, that is known as steering capacity. Your ability as a government to actually guide socio-economic development. And the key way to do this is, of course, would be by providing infrastructure, providing the roads, creating sewage system, clean water, electricity grid, or education, healthcare, and those can be thought of as a policy area where the government can steer the way your economy is going and the way people live. They live healthier or less healthier, whether they are educated or not educated, whether you have educated populace that can provide the kind of skills that businesses need, and things like that. If you don't provide education, you're not going to provide your businesses with the kind of high skill labor that might be looking for. So again, this steering is really, I would say, the core of the state capacity. And the interesting thing about the steering capacity is, I mean, we can sometimes talk about state being powerful or less powerful. The United States is generally considered the most powerful country in the world because it has large economy, fairly competitive economy, has a large military. But the United States probably is not one of the highest states when it comes to state capacity. And this simply because the US chooses to extract less, right? In many ways, our taxes are less, and it chooses to steer less. It chooses to be less intrusive in society. It lets a lot of private businesses to do a lot of things that in other country, especially in communist country, in the past were done by the government. And this, of course, reduces the ability of state to do something that might be very necessary. So the ability to maybe fight a flu epidemic might be limited in the US because the creation of the vaccine is something that's largely left to the private producers. For instance, we can talk about the experiences of frustrating experiences you see sometimes during the flu season where one goes to pharmacy and get flu shots, but there are not enough flu vaccines for children. The reason being is the dosage for children are small and pharmaceutical companies can make more money by first when there wasn't enough of flu vaccine to go around. They can make more money selling to adults rather than to children. So the pharmacies that were servicing adults had enough flu vaccine, but there wasn't enough pediatricians to take care of children simply because we let the market guide which type of vaccine production is more lucrative. Now, of course, when you really have a flu epidemic, the ones that pass the flu quicker than anybody else because they are constantly drooling and licking each other are small children. So it's not in fact a very effective way to actually stop the spread of flu, but instead it was a fantastic way for the company to make most amount of money given there was a limited amount of vaccine. And in a society where the government has greater control over production of the flu vaccine and where it goes uh, to you would have been a different result. So that's just one example of steering capacity. Now, of course, US does have, don't disparage it and say it has no steering capacity, but to we tend to say that there are some countries, especially Western European, in Western Europe, that have a far higher steering capacity simply because the government is more involved in many types of policy that are left up to private sector in the United States. Now, the third aspect of the state capacity is known as legitimation. And this is the idea that you can get people to do things for you simply because you create a sense of legitimacy in it. And this creates consensus, and people will follow what you do. So, again, going back to the flu example, we might say, well, a government could have said, listen, we want children to have more flu vaccine first and foremost. We can appeal to you, the pharmaceutical company, to make smaller, less lucrative doses first for the benefit of the society. Now, if those pharmaceutical companies said yes, that's what we meant to do, even though it will hurt us, we see that it has a legitimate. We see this is an area where government should be able to tell us what to do. We will do it for you for the well-being of the country. Now, in the US, there is less sense of that. You do things first and foremost for the profit, right? But maybe in some countries, um, you might do certain things because you simply feel it's legitimate. And of course, I think legitimacy is closely related to the extractive capacity. When we are talking about taxation being the one way that you extract money, nobody likes to pay taxes. But I would be perfectly honest with you, I accept the taxes that I pay because I trust in the legitimacy overall of the government. I think the most of the things that the government does with the money are legitimate. I have no problem with the money going to the schools, the education system, and I would not mind, me personally having a universal healthcare system. I would put my money towards that because I would see it as a legitimate goal and something that the government should be able to do. Now, of course, many people don't agree with that and they say, I would rather have my taxation be limited and I will take personal responsibility for providing education for my family and providing healthcare for my family. Now, there can be huge problems with that if you are not feeling what your government does is legitimate. You will try to get around paying taxes. So it's very important for the government to have a sense of legitimacy to get the people behind the policy that it has. Otherwise, the dissent would probably lead to the government being replaced, a new regime coming in that has a different policy goals. So the legitimacy is very important and it allows you to do certain things and to steer in certain areas because public would see it being necessary. Maybe another quick example, again going to public health, would be the idea that in the 1980s or early 1980s in the United States, government had like early 1980s, if the US government had spent a lot of money on AIDS research, it wouldn't have been as seen as legitimate. The society as a whole viewed AIDS in those days as something that didn't impact, and it was impacting group that most society didn't care about. It took a while until it was seen as legitimately as a disease or as a virus that need to be combated by the government. That it was okay for the government to spend money on it. It took a while for that to be seen as a legitimate goal, and absent of that, if the government had tried to take these steps earlier on, it would have caused a big problem for the government. A lot of people would have said, uh, "Don't spend money on this. We don't feel it as a legitimate goal." So that's the aspect of legitimation. Now, the other side of it, if you can't do things through a sense of legitimacy, if people don't agree with you, you can still get uh, people to do something for you. And that would be through coercion, pushing them to do something, dominating them, forcing them to do things by the use of force or threatening to use of force, of course. In a communist society, you probably had a mixture of two of things, that is legitimation and coerciveness, because we had this strong education system and a strong steering capacity in education to create young socialists. I would use the word somewhat brainwashed socialist. So people did feel that it was legitimate what government was doing because they had always been told that the goals or the job of the government were legitimate. Of course, when uh, when this fell short, when people started to suffer, and when they stopped seeing a lot of growth after the 1960s or in the 1970s, people no longer started viewing the communist government as legitimate, and the government had to step in and be a little more coercive. We're talking about martial law, punishments, putting in jail, things, people, whatever it might uh, make it right. That's the coercive aspect of state capacity. So if you can't get legitimacy behind it, you might need to use people to do certain things for you. Uh, so these